Time began to unravel in Mara's house long before she realized it. It started subtly, like a thread loosening from a sweater. A second that lingered too long, a minute that felt strangely hollow, a moment that stretched just a little wider than it should have. She blamed exhaustion at first, stress, the kind of frayed nerves that made hours feel slippery and unreliable. But the truth revealed itself slowly, with the patience of something ancient. On the fourth night, she woke again at 3 a.m., not violently this time, not gasping, just awake, as though her eyes had opened on their own, without her permission. The darkness felt different, thicker, more deliberate. She reached for her phone, expecting to see the familiar glow of the screen, the numbers that had become a quiet threat. But when she tapped it, the light flickered strangely, as though struggling to exist. The digits appeared slowly, one by one, like they were being written by an unseen hand. 3 a.m., exactly. Again. She sat up, her breath shallow. The house was silent, but not empty. The silence felt alive, humming faintly beneath the surface like a current running through the walls. She swung her legs over the side of the bed and stood, her feet cold against the wooden floor. The hallway outside her room was darker than usual. The nightlight she had left plugged in glowed weakly, its light dimmed to a sickly, fading pulse. She walked toward it, and with each step, the air grew heavier, as though she were wading through something thick and invisible. When she reached the living room, she froze. The world outside her window had stopped. A car sat in the middle of the street, headlights frozen in mid-glow. A tree branch hung suspended in the air, caught in the middle of a sway that would never finish. Even the dust motes drifting through the beam of the street lamp were motionless, suspended like tiny stars in a dead sky. Time had halted, not slowed, not faltered, stopped. She pressed her hand to the window, her breath fogging the glass. The world beyond felt distant, unreachable, as though she were looking into a photograph instead of a street she had walked 1,000 times. Behind her, the house creaked softly. She turned slowly, her pulse quickening. The shadows in the living room shifted, stretching across the floor like spilled ink. They moved with a purpose, sliding toward her in long, deliberate lines. But nothing cast them. There was no figure, no object, no source. Just the shadows themselves, alive and hungry. She backed away, her breath trembling. The shadows paused as though sensing her fear, then began to crawl up the walls, twisting into shapes that made her stomach twist. They formed angles that shouldn't exist, curves that defied logic, patterns that felt like they were trying to speak. She closed her eyes, but the darkness behind her eyelids was worse. It pulsed with the same unnatural rhythm as the shadows, as though something was pressing against the inside of her skull, trying to seep into her thoughts. When she opened her eyes again, the shadows had retreated. But the room was wrong. The clock on the wall read 3 a.m., her phone read 3 a.m., the oven clock read 3 a.m., every device, every display, every measure of time. Frozen, she walked through the house, her footsteps echoing strangely, as though the sound had nowhere to go. The air felt thick, heavy, unmoving. She reached the kitchen and turned on the faucet, desperate for some sign of normalcy. The water didn't fall. It hung in the air, suspended in a perfect arc, droplets frozen like glass beads. Her breath caught, her hands shook. She reached out and touched one of the droplets. It was cold, solid, unmoving. She stumbled back, her heart pounding. The house seemed to tilt around her, the walls bending subtly, the floor shifting beneath her feet. She felt dizzy, disoriented, as though she were standing on the edge of a world that no longer obeyed the rules she had always taken for granted. Then she heard it, a soft, distant whisper. Not from the walls this time, not from the vents, from everywhere. "Mara." The voice was patient, gentle, almost tender, as though it were comforting her, as though it were welcoming her. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the whisper seeped through her fingers, through her skin, through the air itself. It wrapped around her like a cold embrace, pulling her deeper into the stillness. Time had stopped for a reason. It had stopped for her, and she was no longer alone in the hour that didn't belong to the living. The house felt heavier that night, as though it had grown denser, thicker, more substantial in the hours since the world outside had frozen. Mara sensed it the moment she stepped into the living room. A subtle shift in the air, a quiet tightening of the walls, the faintest tremor beneath her feet. It was as if the house had inhaled deeply and was holding the breath, waiting for her to notice. She didn't want to be awake. She didn't want to be conscious in this hour that didn't belong to her. But sleep had become a stranger, and fear had become a companion. She sat on the couch, her knees drawn to her chest, staring at the frozen world beyond the window. The street lamp's glow hung suspended in the air, a halo of unmoving dust motes trapped in amber. The car in the road remained perfectly still, its headlights frozen mid-beam. Even the shadows outside seemed locked in place, as though time itself had been pinned down. Inside the house, however, something moved. A soft shift of weight, a subtle creak of wood, a whisper of air displaced by something that did not breathe. Mara felt it before she heard it, a presence settling into the room with her, quiet and patient. The temperature dropped, not sharply, but gradually, like a tide pulling away from the shore. Her breath fogged faintly in the air. She didn't turn around. She didn't need to. The presence was behind her, close, too close. A voice rose from the darkness, distant and wet, as though spoken from the bottom of a deep well. "You are awake." The words slid through the room like oil, coating the air, seeping into the spaces between her thoughts. Mara's fingers dug into the fabric of the couch. She kept her eyes fixed on the window, on the frozen world outside, on anything that wasn't the thing speaking behind her. "You wake when others sleep," the voice continued, patient and deliberate. "You drift between the hours. You slip through the cracks." Her throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, to scream. But the rules she had read echoed in her mind. Never speak during the devil's hour. The voice moved closer, though she heard no footsteps. It simply arrived, as though the darkness itself had shifted. "You are closest to the place between worlds," it murmured. "Closer than most, closer than you know." Her breath trembled. She felt the presence lean in, felt the cold of it brush against the back of her neck like a shadow with weight. "Come with me." The words were soft, almost gentle, almost kind. But beneath them was something vast, a hunger, an emptiness, a depth that had no bottom. Mara shook her head, barely able to breathe. "No," she whispered, the word escaping before she could stop it. The house reacted instantly. The walls shuddered, groaning as though something enormous had pressed against them from the outside. The floorboards cracked beneath her feet, splintering like ribs under pressure. The lights flickered violently, casting the room into a stuttering nightmare of shifting shadows. The presence behind her did not move, did not flinch, did not raise its voice. It simply sighed, a long, disappointed exhale that made the air tremble. You refuse, it said softly. You cling to the world that does not want you. You cling to the hours that do not belong to you. The house bent inward, the ceiling lowering by an inch, then another, as though the structure itself were bowing under the weight of something unseen. You do not understand, the voice whispered. You are already halfway here. Mara pressed her hands to her ears, but the voice seeped through her fingers, through her skin, through the marrow of her bones. You cannot refuse what has already begun. The floor beneath her rippled, the wood bending like liquid. The shadows on the walls twisted into long, reaching shapes, stretching toward her with slow, deliberate intent. She stumbled backward, her breath ragged, her heart pounding. The room warped around her, the angles bending, the corners stretching, the ceiling pulsing like a living thing. The presence remained still. You will come with me, it said, not as a threat, but as a certainty. Not tonight, not yet, but soon. The house exhaled again, and the pressure eased. The walls straightened, the floor stilled, the lights steadied. But the presence did not leave. It lingered behind her, quiet and patient, as though waiting for her to accept the truth she had been running from. The devil's hour was not a time, it was a place, and she was already standing in its doorway. Mara didn't remember falling asleep. She only remembered the sensation of drifting, not into rest, but into something deeper, darker, and far less forgiving. When she opened her eyes, the house was silent in a way that felt unnatural, as though every sound had been swallowed whole. The air was thick, unmoving, heavy with the weight of something watching. She sat up slowly, her body aching with a fatigue that felt older than she was. The room around her seemed stretched, subtly distorted, as though the walls had shifted while she slept. The corners were too sharp, the shadows too long, the ceiling too low. She blinked, trying to clear her vision, but the room remained wrong. She stood, her legs trembling, and stepped into the hallway. It was longer, not by much, just a few inches, maybe a foot, but enough that her breath caught in her throat. The familiar space had been pulled like taffy, stretched into something unfamiliar. She walked forward slowly, her footsteps echoing strangely, as though the floorboards were hollow. The hallway bent slightly to the left. It had never bent before. She stopped, her pulse quickening. The air felt colder here, the shadows thicker, clinging to the walls like damp cloth. She reached out and touched the wallpaper. It felt warm, too warm, as though something beneath it was breathing. She pulled her hand back quickly. The house shifted again. A soft groan rippled through the walls, followed by a subtle shudder beneath her feet. The floorboards bowed inward, then outward, as though the house were stretching itself, testing its limits. She stumbled, catching herself against the wall, and felt it pulse beneath her palm. She jerked away, her breath trembling. The hallway behind her was gone, not vanished, transformed. The space she had just walked through had elongated, the walls curving inward like the throat of some enormous creature. The nightlight she had left plugged in flickered weakly at the far end, now impossibly distant. She turned back toward her bedroom. It was gone, too. In its place was another hallway, identical, but wrong. The angles were off, the shadows too deep, the air too still. She took a step backward, and the floor beneath her rippled like water. Panic surged through her. She ran. The hallway stretched with her, lengthening with every step, the doors on either side multiplying, shifting, rearranging themselves. Some were too tall, others too narrow, some upside down, some sideways. The house was rearranging itself around her, reshaping its bones, bending its geometry into something that defied logic. She reached for a doorknob, desperate for escape, but the metal twisted beneath her hand, reshaping itself into a smooth, featureless surface. She tried another door, the same, another. The same. The house was sealing itself, closing her in, guiding her deeper. Her breath came in sharp, ragged gasps. She pressed her back against the wall, but it pulsed again, warm and alive, as though something beneath the surface was shifting, crawling, waiting. The house inhaled. The lights flickered, and the walls began to close in, slowly at first, a subtle narrowing of the hallway, then faster, the space tightening around her like a fist. She stumbled forward, her hands scraping against the walls as they pressed inward. The ceiling lowered, the floor rose, the air thickened. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed instantly, absorbed by the house as though it were feeding on it. She dropped to her knees, her breath trembling, her vision blurring. The walls pressed closer, 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 until she could feel the heat of them against her skin, the pulse of something alive beneath the wallpaper. Then, just as the space threatened to crush her, the walls stopped. They held her there, suspended in a narrow corridor barely wide enough for her to breathe. The air was hot, humid, suffocating. She pressed her palms against the walls, feeling the slow rhythmic thrum beneath them. A heartbeat, not hers, not human. The house exhaled. The walls released her. She collapsed onto the floor, gasping, her body shaking. The hallway around her slowly widened again, the walls retreating, the ceiling lifting, the floor settling. The house returned to its previous shape, or something close to it, as though nothing had happened. But Mara knew better. The house wasn't a house anymore. It was a throat, and she was being swallowed. Mara didn't know how long she lay on the floor after the house released her. Minutes, hours, something in between. Time had become a soft, unreliable thing, slipping through her fingers like water. When she finally pushed herself upright, her limbs felt heavy, as though gravity had thickened around her. The air tasted stale, metallic, as if she had been breathing the same breath over and over again. She stood slowly, her legs trembling beneath her, and looked around. The house was still, too still. The walls no longer pulsed, the floor no longer rippled, the shadows no longer crawled. Everything was frozen in a perfect, suffocating calm. She walked toward the living room, each step echoing faintly, as though the house had grown cavernous. The world outside the window remained suspended. The car in the street, the tree branch mid-sway, the dust motes hanging in the air like tiny, unmoving stars. But something was different. The light had changed. It wasn't night anymore. It wasn't morning. It wasn't anything she recognized. The sky outside was a deep, bruised violet, a color that didn't belong to any hour she had ever seen. It pulsed faintly, like the slow beat of a dying heart. The street lamp's glow had dimmed to a sickly, flickering ember, casting long, distorted shadows across the pavement. She checked the clock on the wall. 3:00 a.m., her phone. 3:00 a.m., the oven. 3:00 a.m., every device, every display, every measure of time. Still frozen, still perfect, still waiting. She felt a cold weight settle in her chest. She walked through the house, searching for something, anything, that might break the illusion. She opened drawers, turned on faucets, flipped light switches. Everything responded, but sluggishly, as though moving through thick syrup. The water from the faucet dripped in slow, heavy beads, each droplet falling with unnatural reluctance. She touched one. It clung to her finger like glue. Her breath trembled. She walked to the front door and pulled it open. The world outside was silent. Not quiet. Silent. No wind, no distant traffic, no rustle of leaves, no hum of electricity. The silence was absolute, a vacuum that swallowed every sound before it could exist. She stepped outside, her bare feet touching the cold concrete of the porch. The air felt wrong. Too dense, too still, as though the atmosphere itself had thickened. She walked down the steps, her heartbeat loud in her ears, and approached the frozen car in the street. The headlights glowed faintly, but the beams didn't move. They hung in the air like solid pillars of light, unmoving, unchanging. She reached out and touched one. It was warm, alive, breathing. She jerked her hand back, her pulse racing. The world wasn't frozen. It was held in place by something vast and unseen. She turned slowly, her eyes scanning the street. The houses around her looked normal at first glance, but the longer she stared, the more wrong they became. The angles were off, the windows too dark, the roofs too steep, the shadows too deep. It was as though the world had been recreated from memory, a memory that didn't quite understand how things were supposed to look. She backed away, her breath trembling, and returned to her house. The door closed behind her, with a soft click that echoed far too loudly in the stillness. She stood in the living room, staring at the frozen clock. 3:00 a.m. forever. The realization settled over her slowly, like a shroud. She wasn't trapped in time. She wasn't caught in a loop. She wasn't dreaming. She had crossed into something else, something that existed alongside her world, beneath it, behind it. A place where time didn't move because time didn't belong. The Devil's Hour wasn't a moment on a clock. It was a realm, a dimension, a territory, and she was inside it. The house creaked softly behind her. She turned. The shadows on the far wall shifted, stretching upward, twisting into a shape that was almost human, but not quite. The air grew colder, the light dimmer, the silence deeper. Something stepped forward from the darkness. Not a figure, not a creature, a presence. A shape made of absence, a silhouette carved from the void. It didn't speak. It didn't need to. She felt its voice inside her mind, soft and patient. You see now. Her breath caught. You understand. The shadows pulsed. You are here. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding, her vision blurring. The presence moved closer, its form shifting like smoke, like ink in water, like something that had never been meant to take shape in the human world. This hour is not a time, it whispered inside her. It is a place, and you have crossed the threshold. She pressed her back against the wall, her breath trembling. There is no going back. The presence leaned closer, its form towering over her, its edges dissolving into the air. You belong to the hour now. The clock on the wall flickered. 3:00 a.m., 3:00 a.m., 3:00 a.m., forever. Mara didn't remember collapsing. She didn't remember the moment her legs gave out or the way the floor rose to meet her. She only remembered the darkness, thick, warm, and strangely soft, folding around her like a cocoon. It held her gently, almost tenderly, as though cradling her between one world and the next. When she opened her eyes, she was standing, not lying, not sitting, standing. The transition was seamless, dreamlike, as though she had been lifted upright by invisible hands. Her breath trembled as she looked around. She was no longer in her house. The space around her was a corridor, long, narrow, and impossibly dark. The walls were made of something that looked like wood, but felt like stone. smooth and cold, stretching upward into a ceiling she couldn't see. The air was thick with the scent of dust and old secrets, the kind of smell that clings to forgotten places. A faint glow pulsed along the floor, illuminating the edges of the hallway in a soft, sickly light. It wasn't enough to see clearly, but it was enough to see the doors. There were hundreds of them, thousands, stretching into infinity. Each door was different, some old and rotting, others polished and new, some ornate, some plain, some tall, some narrow, some crooked, some perfectly straight. They lined the corridor like teeth in a monstrous jaw, each one humming faintly with a presence she could feel but not see. She took a step forward, her bare feet touching the cold floor. The air shifted around her, carrying with it a faint murmur, a whispering chorus that rose and fell like distant waves. She strained to listen, her heart pounding. Voices, hundreds of them, thousands, some crying, some pleading, some whispering names, some whispering nothing at all. She moved closer to one of the doors, her breath trembling. The wood was old, cracked, splintered. She pressed her ear against it. A woman sobbed softly on the other side, a soft, broken sound, a sound of someone who had been crying for a very long time. Mara stepped back, her stomach twisting. She walked to another door, a tall, narrow one with peeling blue paint. She touched the handle, and the metal pulsed beneath her fingers like a heartbeat. She jerked her hand away. The whispering grew louder. She turned slowly, her breath catching in her throat. Something stood at the far end of the corridor, a shape, a silhouette, a presence. It was tall, impossibly tall, its head brushing the unseen ceiling. Its body was thin, elongated, shifting like smoke, like shadow, like something that had never been meant to take form. Its edges dissolved into the darkness, as though the corridor itself were trying to swallow it. It moved without moving, gliding toward her, with a slow, deliberate grace. The air grew colder with each inch it closed, the whispers around her rising into a frantic chorus. She couldn't breathe. She couldn't move. She couldn't look away. The presence stopped inches from her, towering over her like a living eclipse. The darkness around it pulsed, bending inward, drawn to it like gravity. A voice rose inside her mind, not spoken, not heard, felt. You are awake. Her breath trembled. You have crossed the threshold. The corridor darkened, the doors trembling softly as though reacting to the presence. You stand in the hour that does not end. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. I don't want this, she whispered, her voice barely audible. The presence leaned closer, its form bending in ways that defied anatomy. Want has nothing to do with it. The doors along the corridor shuddered violently, the whispers rising into a cacophony of fear and despair. The presence lifted a hand, long, thin, made of shadow and nothingness, and touched the center of her forehead. The world dissolved. She gasped, stumbling backward, her vision blurring. The corridor flickered, the doors warping, the whispers twisting into a single unified voice, her voice. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. Only a whisper, soft, wet, patient. A whisper that echoed through the corridor, slipping beneath the doors, seeping into the cracks, joining the chorus of trapped voices. A whisper that did not belong to her anymore. The presence stepped back, its form dissolving into the darkness. You are awake, it whispered inside her, and that means you are mine. The corridor stretched into infinity. The doors trembled, the whispers rose, and Mara's voice, no longer her own, drifted through the endless hallway, searching for the next soul to wake at exactly 3 a.m. The devil's hour had claimed her, and now she would claim others forever. Hey, if you liked this video and want more content, please do like, comment, and subscribe. Also, if you want to share some of your personal scary stories, email us using the email in the description. Haunt you later.